Alright, what's going on everyone? Today I'm going to show you how to upgrade the Cavalcade Charge Challenger deck. These Challenger decks are amazing out of the box, but with a few small upgrades we can push these just a little bit closer to the tier 1 deck list that the professionals play. Also, before I get started, sorry if my voice sounds a little bit weak. I do have a slight cough. I don't know if it's just a cold or something more serious. It's not a big deal. I am 100% fine. Just a slight cough, very mild symptoms, but my voice is a little scratchy and a little weak. Apologies for that. So the funny thing about the Cavalcade Charge deck is, well, it's basically done. I mean, yeah, that's it. Deck's done. That's the end of the video, guys. Thanks for watching. Actually, there are a few minor changes we can make. One of the problems with this deck is actually the deck's namesake, Cavalcade of Calamity. It's not actually played in tier 1 lists because it can be a little bit inconsistent. Don't get me wrong, when it works, it's amazing, and this card will absolutely win you games, but you can also lose games if you draw too many of them and not enough action. So because of that, a lot of the tier 1 lists don't play this, just because if you're going to a tournament and you're spending all of the money on the entry fee at the professional level, you don't want to lose games because of RNG, right? So that's the problem with this card, is there is some luck involved and it can be the reason that you lose a game if you draw too many of them. So consistency is key in professional decks, and because of that, Cavalcade isn't played that often in the top tier deck. So most tier 1 decks instead play Anax. Anax is better since he has power equal to your devotion to red, and the best part is, whenever a red creature you control dies, he'll replace it with a satyr token. And that's important because aggro's biggest weakness is losing creatures to blockers, removal spells, or the dreaded board sweepers. The fact that Anax will leave tokens behind to clean up is pretty great. Another card that tier 1 decks play more of is Ember Cleave. Ember Cleave has the same blowout potential that the Cavalcade has because you can flash it in and completely devastate your opponent's side of the board after they declare blockers. It also has some consistency issues. You don't want to draw too many of them, and sometimes you can't cast them, but it's generally more reliable than the enchantment. I mean, it's pretty much always going to be good. Another card that isn't in this deck, but is in much more of the top tier decks, is Robber of the Rich. It's great just for being a 2 mana, 2 power creature with haste, but it has the added benefit of potentially allowing you to cast cards from your opponent's deck. So this card is great. It's very aggressive. It's, 2 mana, 2 power haste is actually pretty powerful, and sometimes it's very relevant to be able to cast your opponent's stuff. But you don't want Robber of the Rich in a Cavalcade deck because it doesn't have 1 power, right? That's the problem. We can't keep taking out 1 power cards for things like Anax and Robber of the Rich. So that's the thing. As a Cavalcade of Calamity deck, this deck is basically done, and the only way to really upgrade it is to move out of the Cavalcade strategy and push into just a more solid sort of, down to earth mono red aggro deck without trying to rely on Cavalcade. The only way to really improve this as a Cavalcade deck is probably to include the Phoenix. Chandra's Phoenix is really good, but it also increases the jankiness because it's really bad without the Cavalcade. So you're putting more reliance on a card that's already a little bit unreliable. So that's up to you, but I'm going to show you how to upgrade this into the more competitive tier 1 decks. So if you want to do that, you're going to want to take out the 4 Cavalcade of Calamity and replace them with 4 Anax Hardened in the Forge. This might seem weird because Anax is legendary, but there's a fun trick with him. If you already have an Anax in play and you play a second one, you'll actually get 4 satyr tokens. Even if Anax is the only card you have in play, you'll have 4 devotion, right? You'll have 2 Anaxes, so there'll be 4 3s while you choose which one you want to keep. And then when you have to sacrifice one to the legendary rule, they'll both trigger. The one that you originally had will see the new one dying with 4 power and put 2 tokens into play, and Anax himself, when you sacrifice him, will also put 2 tokens in play for dying with 4 power. So you could play 4 copies of Anax just because if you do happen to draw like 3 copies of them, that's fine. At that point, they're basically 3 mana, put 4/1/1 tokens into play, which is not bad for an aggro deck. Ideally, you would prefer to save them and play them when Annex dies, but there's no danger of having dead cards because extra copies of Annex are just fine. You also want to replace one Torbran with one Ember Cleave. Torbran is great, but 4 copies is a lot to play, not only because he's legendary, but also he's very expensive for an aggro deck. Now Ember Cleave is also expensive, but the cost is often reduced and it will frequently blow out the opponent the turn it enters the battlefield, so paying 2 or 3 mana for an Ember Cleave, totally worth it. And Torbran's fine, great card, just 4 copies is pushing it. If you've been playing this deck out of the box, you may have noticed that you do occasionally draw too many Torbrans, and that's because 4 copies of him it is a lot. It's a lot for an aggro deck to have 4 copies of a 4-drop that's also legendary. So we would love to have this every single game, but we don't also want to risk drawing too many of them in every single game. The final change you'll want to make is to replace 3 10th Street Dodgers with 3 Robbers of the Rich. The Dodger is mostly in the deck to take advantage of Cavalcade, but without the enchantment, I think the Robber is much better. A 2 mana 2 power creature with haste is pretty great, and sometimes the cards you can steal with it are very relevant, so definitely recommended. The final change is optional, but a lot of decks run 3 to 4 copies of Ember Cleave, so if you want to squeeze in a 3rd or 4th one, you can do so by taking out Rimrock Knight. I don't think this is 100% necessary, and sometimes you can get flooded with too many cleaves. I personally think 4 is too many. I see a lot of decks running 4, and the people who run 4 really love Ember Cleave, but much like Torbran, I am worried about playing too many Ember Cleaves. I personally prefer 3, so at the very least you can replace a Rimrock Knight with an Ember Cleave if you want to, and you could go to 4 Ember Cleaves if you want. That's up to you, but these can be changed with Ember Cleaves for sure. It also depends on whether you want to spend the extra like $10 each for the Ember Cleaves. You could just play 2 and that's fine. You can also upgrade the mana base with the 4th copy of Castle Ember. The deck comes with 3, and honestly, I think that's totally fine. I think 3 castles is not gonna hurt at all. In fact, playing too many means you do run the risk of drawing only castles and having them all come into play tapped, but most tier 1 decks do play the full 4 copies. So if you want to replace the mountain with a 4th copy of Castle Ember, I think that's totally fine. Something else to take into consideration, some players prefer to play Shock over Rimrock Knight. I personally don't like Shock. I just don't like Shock in general. Every time I play it in a deck, I just feel like Shock is terrible, but some people do play Shock over Rimrock Knight. I just don't think it's powerful enough to run in a deck, and I'm usually unhappy to see it. It's good against other mono red decks, like if you can Shock a Fervent Champion or a Scorch Spitter, it's pretty good, but I personally think Bone Crusher Giant is fine for that, and I don't like to use up space in the deck for Shock personally, but if you prefer more burn, that is totally an option. You can replace the remaining Rimrock Knights with Shock if you prefer to play more interaction. It should also be noted that some decks are also squeezing in 1 to 3 copies of Phoenix of Ash, usually by taking out Runaway Steamkins or Rimrock Knights. It's really slow, but it keeps coming back from the graveyard, so it gives the deck some late game potential. If you're finding that you're getting your opponent down to like, less than 5 life, but you can't finish off the game, that's what Phoenix of Ash is being used for in some decks. It's kind of a toss up because on one hand, you're giving yourself an opportunity to have a late game finisher, but that's also slowing down your early game plan. So you're going to have games where you draw like Phoenix of Ash, Annex, and Torbrans, and then you're not even really an aggro deck at that point. If you're drawing all 3 and 4 drops, that's way too slow. So that is an option, and it's not in every deck. Some people run it, some people don't. This is another card that I would prefer to see in the sideboard, and I would rather bring it in against decks with lots of board sweepers and spot removal. This feels more like a sideboard card to me, but some people do play it in the main board, so I just thought it was worth noting at least. And speaking of the sideboards though, the 4 copies of Shock make no sense at all to me. Shock's okay if you want to bring it in against other mono-red aggro decks, but I think 2 copies of Fry and 2 copies of Red Cap Melee make a lot more sense. These cards are more situational, but they're far more powerful, which is kind of the point of sideboards. You could bring the Melee in against other mono red decks, and you can kill off their Torbrans, which Shock can't. And Fry is great for opposing to Furies and Dream Trawlers if the opponent doesn't have anything in hand to give it hexproof. So yeah, Red Cap Melee and Fry are just so much better as sideboard burn spells. They make a lot more sense, a lot better than Shock in my opinion. And you can also take out the Slaying Fires in the sideboard because these are terrible, and you can replace them with Scorching Dragon Fires. They do a little bit less damage and they also cost less, they're just faster, but they're fantastic against the Rakdos Sacrifice deck as you can kill their Cauldron Familiars and they'll be exiled, so they will not be coming back. What you do is you wait for them to sacrifice it, right? They always wait until the end of your turn and then they sacrifice the cat and bring it back, and then once the Cauldron is tapped and they can't sacrifice it anymore, then you Dragon Fire and it's gone forever. So yeah, that's it guys. That is that's all we have to do really. I mean, this deck is pretty much done out of the box. You don't really need to do much to it. I think you're pretty much fine. I mean, just getting a couple Ember Cleaves in makes the deck done. The sideboard is really the issue, and then it's just a matter of whether or not you want to get out of the Cavalcade plan and go with a more, you know, down-to-earth aggro plan. So yeah, that's it. Not much to do here really. Anyway, yeah, I hope this video was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.